Hello, everyone. Michele Tittler here from Race-Based Law. I am the chief of ERBL Canada, ERBL Tribe. And I just want you to know that even though it's October 21st, 2022, this is not a costume and should not be taken as a costume. I really am the chief. As you can see, I'm even wearing the shirt to prove it. And joining me today is my political partner and husband slash ex-husband, best friend, really the expert on this subject in all of Canada, one could say. I know he wouldn't, but anyone else would. Jerry Gagnon, how are you, Jerry?
I'm fine, Michelle. How are you today?
I'm excellent. Now, I'm just going to introduce this a little bit, and then I'm going to pass it on to Jerry, because this is a story that fascinated me so much. I reacted so severely to it that I said we have to do a video on it. This is a story from 2020, and it's still going on in 2022, almost Christmas time. We're in like close to November, October 31st. And it's gone through the Human Rights Tribunal and everything. And I said, Jerry, you have to say this on video. Everyone has to know how crazy all of these race grievance politics have become in particular BC, because the land wasn't formally ceded in the same way it was across Canada with all the treaties, even though there was an understanding that the land was ceded. And so I just want to say that this meeting and this Zoom call and this recording is coming to you from the understanding that this was ceded land. Vancouver, BC, Canada. And so I want you to explain this story to everybody. I'm going to pass it on to you, Jerry. And then in the future, Jerry and I are going to be making these videos, but Jerry's going to be just on phone, because just setting up a shot and all that trouble, he's not the technician for the camera, and it's not his comfort zone. And he's much better speaker. He's really comfortable, and I really don't want to have the hassle of the shot. So from here on in, after we have this nice intro, he might appear now and then, but really he's going to just come across on the phone, and we're just going to bang out a lot of videos, because it's too much trouble to keep setting up his room for a shot that I'm never happy with, because I'm a camera person. Right, Jer? Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to you now, my friend. If you guys see orbs flying around, I think I just saw one. I often have orbs that show up in my videos, so watch for them. All right, Jerry, you take it. This is a story that should fascinate everybody. It's so on the edge as far as it gets in grievance politics. Here we go. Race-based grievance politics.
Yes, hi. This story is up on our website, andracebasedlaw.ca, and it's entitled "It's Never Enough." And I chose that title because this story exemplifies how Canadians, especially Canadian officials, are bending over backwards to accommodate even perceived slights against Aboriginals, and going to great lengths to try and make up for it. And it's never enough. The origins of this story are in January 2020, when an elderly Aboriginal gentleman and his granddaughter went into a Bank of Montreal in Vancouver. He had received $30,000 as part of a, quote, land claims settlement with our federal government. Every member of the tribe, every adult member of the tribe, was receiving $30,000 as part of the settlement. Most Canadians never hear of these stories because it's not even in the news most of the time. The government paying out tens of millions of dollars for, quote, treaty violations or land settlements, even in cases back east where the land was surrendered by treaty. So anyway, this gentleman and his granddaughter went into the Bank of Montreal, presented ID. He wanted to open a bank account for her so he could transfer money into it. The teller, part of what he provided for ID, this may have caused part of the problem, was his status card. And a lot of Canadians have never seen an Aboriginal status card, especially if they're immigrants relatively recent to this country. They have no idea what this race-based card that designates a racial status for someone is all about. Anyway, the teller became concerned with the authenticity of the ID and went upstairs to speak to her manager. After a consultation with him, the bank phoned Vancouver police and implied that they suspected a fraud was being committed and wanted police to come and check it out. Upon the arrival of the police, of course, the elderly gentleman got upset. They were asked to step outside, and we don't know the specifics of what ensued in the conversation between them and the police, but the end result was the police arresting both the elderly Aboriginal gentleman and his granddaughter. After about an hour at the police station and calls back to the bank and calls to the tribal office, etc., it was cleared up, and the gentleman and his granddaughter were released with apologies from the police involved. That didn't end the matter, although for most people that would have been the end of the story. The Aboriginal gentleman took the case to the BC Human Rights Tribunal. Now, just a little diversion here for a moment about human rights tribunals. There are human rights commissions in Canada, both federal and provincial, that investigate human rights complaints in the broader sense. And then there are these things called human rights tribunals, which is really an unconstitutional court. And I say unconstitutional because before a human rights tribunal, only the person doing the accusing gets support. They get funding to press their complaint. They are allowed to use legal counsel to press their complaint, but the defendant gets nothing. They get no help in enacting a defense, and they're not allowed to bring a lawyer to the hearing. This is where I call it unconstitutional. Before any court in this country, you are entitled to legal representation. And the denial of that will usually get the case thrown out of court. But tribunals by law do not allow the defendant to have legal representation. So this case was taken before the BC Human Rights Tribunal, and the tribunal ruled that their human rights had been violated. And it ordered apologies on behalf of the bank, on behalf of the police. The bank not only apologized, but gave a financial restitution. We don't know the amount. No one's ever revealed what the amount was. And at that point, you would think, okay, as unfair as all of that seems to have been, the matter at least is finished. But no, the tribe, which is the Heiltsuk tribe, which is about, they're located about 500 kilometers north of BC on the coast. They are one of the old recognized tribes in BC. And I'll get into a little bit about their past a little later on here once we get through the body of this story. The Heiltsuk decided that according to their, quote, protocols, they needed to have an apology feast where the community would be invited and, of course, the offended people. And the police were told they were supposed to come up to Heiltsuk territory, which is Bella Bella area, and attend this apology feast and apologize to the victims and the tribe itself for what had occurred. Now, we're not quite sure what happened in terms of the administration of the police here, but the end result was Adam Palmer, the Vancouver chief of police, chartered a plane and took 20 officials up to Bella Bella, which there's your global warming carbon footprint again, to attend this feast. But the two officers, who, by the way, both are Asian, one, I believe, male and one female, they did not attend. They refused to go. And it's my suspicion that the union must have stepped in and told Chief Palmer that no, they weren't attending, that this was wrong, and they had already apologized once, and there was no need for this. Because otherwise the police chief would, of course, have forced their attendance, because he certainly thought it important enough to go up there and apologize. So they flew up to Bella Bella, gifts in hand, made an apology, presented the gifts to the tribe and to the victims, at which point the chief very loudly and openly refused the gifts and walked across the room to hand them back to Police Chief Palmer, and basically implied, that the feast was ruined because the two people who needed to apologize hadn't bothered to show up and apologize. And so the tribe was taking this as a further insult on top of what they already called the racist discrimination against their two tribal members. Now, there was never any indication of race being involved in the original. When the complaint was phoned in, it wasn't mentioned to the police that they were Aboriginal. There was no indication from the bank that Aboriginality had anything whatsoever to do. It was simply ID that they were unfamiliar with and regarded with suspicion and wanted clarified before they would allow such a large amount of money to be deposited in their bank account. Part of why I'm a little puzzled is I think it's the law that they have to, I think it's over $10,000. Any deposit has to be, the government has to be notified because that's considered potentially suspicious. But anyway, regardless of that, this is the situation as it occurred. So Chief Palmer and his delegation flew back to Vancouver. The tribe is in the news and on social media as demanding that they still want these two cops to fly up north and apologize on, quote, their territory to their people. And they're not going to be satisfied until the police comply with their wishes. And so at this point, it remains a fairly large story, basically because of one reporter for the CBC. Her name is Angela Sterrett. She's done all the main stories on this particular case that has made it a national issue because of the CBC. She belongs to the Gitskan tribe and is part of CBC's segregated and racist CBC Indigenous broadcasting network, where they only hire Aboriginal people. And they tend to be activists like Ms. Sterrett, who have an obvious bias that in the past would have disqualified them as a journalist in the first place. And so her coverage of this story has been extremely one-sided. And she's basically acted as a spokesperson for the aggrieved parties and the Hailtsuk, quote, nation, unquote. Now, I mentioned previously too, there's a certain irony in all of this in terms of apologies.
Wait, just hang on, everybody. This is the good part. Okay, this is the good part. Okay, this is the good part.
You know, Canada has been apologizing endlessly for past, quote, crimes against Aboriginals, right? For historical crimes, for land theft, for violence, and you name it. Now, I had worked on a previous investigation into slavery amongst Aboriginal tribes on the west coast of BC, historical slavery and how extensive. And there was actually a slave trade network amongst the tribes in coastal BC. And I had come across two exhibits in the Smithsonian Institution, the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, DC. Of course, it's not in Canada because we don't admit this kind of stuff. And the two exhibits were, number one, what was called a slave club, which was used to club slaves. It's a very descriptive title for the club. And it's a memento of the Hailtsuk tribe. The other exhibit is called the Cannibal Bowl, which presumably was used for eating human remains out of. This Cannibal Bowl also is attributed to the Hailtsuk tribe of British Columbia. Now, to the best of my knowledge, there has never been an apology to any of the other Aboriginals of BC or tribes in BC from the Hailtsuk for their slavery, never mind cannibalism, of captured, this is Aboriginals they were doing this to. This is before the British came here and forced British Columbia tribes to stop slave trading. And that was difficult. If anyone familiar with the history of BC will know that slavery was abolished the last place slavery was gotten rid of in Canada was the West Coast Aboriginal tribes who resisted ending one of their, quote, cultural traditions, which was capturing slaves from the tribes they conquered. And of course, sometimes cannibalized, depending on how far back in the past you go. Now, this is the tribe that's now being so self-righteous about the injustice done to two of its members. And I can't help but call that irony.
Okay, so I told you it was good. I told you it was good. So seriously, and here's the thing, there aren't that many tribes in Canada that were just peaceful. They were always warring each other. I mean, they've claimed 115% of BC. They're fighting each other already over who owns the land.
Well, there's no doubt. And I mean, the Heiltsuk, if you look on a map, they're up the coast. They're almost across from the Haida Gwaii Islands. The Haida are another bunch who now are regarded as these peace-loving artists who were brutalized and conquered by the British. The Haida are also known as one of the most warlike tribes in BC. They were famous for their raids up and down the coast on other BC tribes. These are all, and if we're going to accept oral history, then we have to accept these stories are true, even though the white man wasn't here initially to view all of this warfare and slavery and cannibalism. But these are tales told, again, as oral history amongst tribes of BC.
Yes, and as I've said many, many times, they have never been one, ever. They're not one tribe. They're not in one indigenous spirit. The only time they've ever come together for anything ever is to blame white people and to extort from them. That's the only time they've ever been united on anything. And they can't even agree on that.
And interestingly enough, it's the BC tribes that are probably partly because of the Haida's reputation, who are regarded as these lovable, peace-loving bunch. And personally, except for the Iroquois back in Quebec and Ontario, except for sorry about that, that was an incoming phone call. Except for the Iroquois back in the Ontario-Quebec region, I have not found anything like the violence and cruelty that happened here in BC between the warlike tribes. There were peaceful tribes here in BC, and they were the victims of these constant assaults. And so, of course, every time they lost a battle, slaves were taken, and that meant that the losing tribe lost a lot of their people.
Well, Jerry, didn't you just tell me another story recently too? We might as well try to throw it in here. The one where the English saved the tribe that was coming down to destroy another tribe here in BC.
Yes, although I'd like to do a post on that one at some point too, because that's another interesting story. But yes, it was a raiding party from a tribe up the northern coast that came all the way down to what's now New Westminster, and was going to attack I believe what are now the Musqueam, because they were trading with the British. And so they brought an actual fleet, an armada, if you will, of war canoes down to take care of these people. The Musqueam fled into the forest, but not before informing the British colonel at the fort what was going on. The colonel, for whatever reason, maybe because he wanted to protect trade with the Musqueam and the other trading tribes in the area, he waited till the armada got within range of the fort and then opened fire with their cannon and basically blew this armada out of the water. The surviving Aboriginals swam to the shore where the Musqueam came out of the woods and finished off the rest of them. And so it's an example of how both the British and French, the story is portrayed as if the British and French induced the tribes to fight each other, and the British and French were the instigators. When in fact, when you actually look into the particulars of the stories themselves, it tends to be the tribes were already fighting, and the British and or French ended up making friends with one of the tribes and were drawn into the conflict because of that already existing blood feud conflict that probably went back centuries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's very interesting that they're really complaining about their gravesite and children stuff now when in fact this children missing is a pandemic around the world. It isn't just their race. But on top of it all, like, where are all their grave sites? Nobody ever talks about that. Like, they're busy complaining about how the nuns and everybody else isn't taking care of their grave sites. But where are their traditional grave sites?
Well, no, exactly. If you look at, say, if you look at the Haida or the Heiltsuk or tribes who claim to have been here for 10,000 years, and in the same territory they now reside in, you would expect to find really large, old graveyards.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Well, the other
that's
thing too, Jerry, is that, I mean, what's happened, what the globalists and the ruling elites, the Rothschilds, I love using that word now because the anti-Semitic thing is traveling around again, because that's what they did with the Jews. They created World War I in order to victimize the Jews, in order to hide behind being Jew, in order to do whatever they wanted to do. And so now they're doing that with the indigenous, as if we're not all indigenous. Where are the Europeans from? They're indigenous to that continent. Like, that they've selected who is indigenous and who is not, as if anybody with a lighter skin color literally doesn't belong on this planet. So it's dehumanizing people, calling them white supremacy. Well, and that's why they had to take over the Native studies. That was one of the first things they did. They got the Constitution changed in 1982. They put in race laws, and then they took over their education. Like, it's our version of Black Lives Matter and critical race theory, right? So they pumped, and they're on the reserves, all these kids. So they pumped all of this Native studies and white supremacy lies and bullshit to them, getting them ready to dehumanize us and call us, white supremacists. You can't believe how they talk to us. You just cannot believe. It's the most racist dialogue ever in the history of mankind. And it's right here in Canada. And it's from the Aboriginals to what they perceive as white people. It's as if they don't even know that other races live here except white people. But point being, we're all indigenous to this earth, right? But they've selected some, and so what they've done is they've made them the protected group, and so you can't say anything. So they can do whatever they want, whatever they want, whatever they want. And if you say anything, you're a racist, just like you're an anti-Semitic if you say anything about how this group, this cult of Jews who are actually Satanists, not Jews, but they're hiding behind being Jews. They run Hollywood and all that kind of stuff. You can't say that because somehow it's anti-Semitic, but that's what they've done with the Aboriginals too, haven't they, Gerald? I'll pass it on to you.
Well, yes, and I just want to make the point, we need to constantly make this point anyway, that we're not speaking of all Aboriginals here. There are Aboriginals who find this all highly embarrassing and wish that the leaders would just shut up and get on with it and actually just work at helping build their communities, helping look to the future, helping get on with it, as you will.
What everybody needs to know, especially in America, is that the chiefs here, this all goes through the chiefs, okay? Nobody votes those chiefs in, not even their own people. We don't, or anything. It's all a deal that's been made with the chiefs, and the money goes to the chiefs, and then they distribute it from there. There's no democracy. There's no human rights on a reserve, yet they can use our human rights commissions to screw with us. It's just completely dysfunctional.
Well, yeah, and to be fair, like the Indian Act tribes do have elections for chief. Now, the corruption involved, the nepotism, the bribery, etc., is over the top. And that's because these aren't legally municipalities. They're not run under the same laws. And they tend to be extended kinship families. So what you have on reserves is usually the largest, most powerful family always gets the chief.
And the housing too.
And of course, well, because again, unlike in Vancouver, for instance, where the municipal government has no say in where you live or what home you can buy, on the reserve, the chief and council decide who gets which house,
and everybody,
or if they get a house at all.
There was an exodus from the reserves over time because people just were starting to get into the cities or into the other municipalities and just becoming a part of Canadian life. And then with the changes in all of these Aboriginal race laws, they made it so that the chiefs would get more money per head. So it completely lured a lot of activists and people back to the reserves, because they literally get money per head. It's just so corrupt.
Well, and they get housing, they have housing funds too, although again, a lot of it isn't spent on housing.
Yeah, and when something breaks down, all they do is complain and blame Canada. No matter how many times anybody teaches them to fix their pump houses, they break down and blame Canada. It's just unbelievable.
And I should point out that a lot of the people who have left reserves have left because they were outsiders. They were not part of the ruling clique, and they were unable to get housing, or they had their housing taken away from them because they supported a different candidate for election. Now, while we're on the subject of
or if they married a white person, Jerry, okay, they were kicked out of
that too.
They're the most racist people in all of Canada, bar none. Nobody is as racist as the Canadian Aboriginals. Nobody. Like, they are shockingly racist.
Well, and part of the problem is they live under a different set of laws on reserves.
Not be racist. They're allowed to be racist. It's been
than the rest of us are. But that included the fact that up until the Harper government, Aboriginals weren't able to lay human rights complaints, reserve Aboriginals. When the Liberals initially passed that legislation, they, at the urging of chiefs, excluded reserves from Canadian human rights legislation. Now, the Harper government corrected that. And so now there are cases where Aboriginals are able to take their chief or denying them housing, etc., before the Human Rights Commission.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me about that, for sure.
But it's a classic example of how the whole structure of Canada, including our Constitution, has been set up to segregate Aboriginals from the rest of the country.
And the only people who benefit are the chiefs. Everyone needs to know that. All right. It's just, it's horrible. And they're not getting any better. They need to deal with alcoholism and fetal alcohol syndrome. And they need to deal with their incest problem. And they just don't. All they do is blame white people, this white supremacy thing. I mean, imagine going around just calling people niggers. I mean, white supremacist is an even more insulting, degrading term than nigger, because not only are you degrading somebody with this derogatory term, but you're actually assigning activity and intentions and thoughts to them. You are a white supremacist. You're literally assigning their thoughts to them. You're saying you think that you're superior to everybody else. You never said that, but I know that you think you're superior to everybody else simply because you have white skin. I mean, it's probably the most racist thing ever to hit the planet, is calling people white supremacists simply because of their skin. Like, you've assigned intention to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does take it to another level.
Ill intention. You've assigned ill intention to them simply because they were born that way. It's just ugly and evil beyond comprehension. It's way worse than calling somebody just a drunken Indian, or something like that, because that's actually about drinking alcohol.
Mm-hmm. And it's a specific. There's no doubt. And that's part of what's gone on here too. I mean, the police are basically, Vancouver police are basically being accused of that.
Well, and let me go back to Adam Palmer. If anybody's seen any of my other videos, I've been going after Adam Palmer. I mean, he's a total CCP sellout. He's a traitor. He's a globalist. I mean, this is one of the biggest child trafficking ports in all of North America. There are underground tunnels. I mean, he knows, he's connected to all of this stuff. He knows what's going on. All these mayors and police chiefs. I mean, Adam Palmer is corrupt. He's corrupt as hell. Right? Who sold out us out to the CCP here in Vancouver? Where did all this land grab stuff for the CCP come from? I mean, all these houses they're unobtainable anymore because the CCP. That's also our politicians and our police chief and everybody in cahoots with the globalists. So we go back to 1982 with this constitution change. That's when our constitution happened, and that's when last 2 weeks before the constitution, they shoved in race laws. Section 35 of the constitution gives one race inherent rights. Because that is an ambiguous statement, it means that, oh, that could be anything, right, Jerry?
Well, one of the tricks, if you will, sleight of hand, deceits, particularly of the Liberal Party when it's been in power federally, is they write up a law that will force the court to interpret what the law actually means. Instead of clarifying the language in the House of Commons and being specific in the writing of the law, they use these ambiguous phrases. And that allows then the court, who are mostly Liberal appointees, especially when we get to the Supreme Court of Canada, it allows the court to, on behalf of the Liberal Party, state what was really the intent of the law.
Right.
And the Liberal Party just, like Jean Chrétien, just shrugged and said, well, I didn't say that, the court did. So we have to follow what the court says.
And Jerry,
It's so deceitful, it's ridiculous.
that's why we're called end race-based law. It's not called end natives. It's called end race-based law because who is involved in this? White Bay Street lawyers and lobbyists. This is a complete globalist takedown. They're using the natives to take the land, and then they're just going to do away with the natives and have the land. It's a land grab in every country. The natives are so gullible. They're being used. They really think the United Nations is helping them. The United Nations don't care about them. They're the same people that put them in the residential schools. They're so dumb. The natives have been brainwashed beyond comprehension because, they insisted on their native studies, and what they got was brainwashing, and very racist brainwashing. I mean, how horrible to 500 years after Europeans began to settle in this area, and the natives settled from Siberia. I always call them Siberian settlers. And they moved around all over the place. How horrible 500 years later to say, you don't belong here. We own all the land. You stole it from us. And give us your money. They call us their slaves, and and that's what Jerry was just talking about. They have bumper stickers in Manitoba that say, "Get to work, Whitey. I need a new truck." I mean, they're really racist, and they openly make jokes about extorting money from us and how we owe them and we're just their slaves. And that's because the United Nations have dehumanized all of us. We really are dehumanized to them. And it's fascinating that they're the least productive, least sober, least healthy people, like psychologically, physically, spiritually, mentally, and financially. They're the least healthy people in all of Canada. They're the least a part of our culture, and yet they act the most superior. The truth is, there's native supremacy in Canada, and that is very real. Native supremacy is very real in Canada.
Well, the racists within every race.
No, but Jerry,
I know, but let me finish.
Indoctrinated. This is the real systematic, institutionalized, indoctrinated racism. It's literally indoctrinated. Everybody has to take courses. Everybody has to bow to them. Like they're like it's bizarre.
Yes.
You can't even go to work and say the wrong thing without either being fired or being put on some kind of suspension. Then you got to go take a sensitivity course. Like the natives talk to us like it's the most filthy pig dialogue I've ever heard in my entire life. They don't have to take sensitivity courses.
Well, and again, this story we were talking about today is another example of that. The police don't have to come to a feast at your home to apologize when they falsely arrested you. Okay, this is unheard of. Like, I've never heard of such a thing in my life. Like, yeah, the police sometimes will issue a formal statement of apology, which they also did in this case. But that's the most you're ever going to get out of the police for a false arrest. As Adam Palmer himself said, when this case first happened, he said those two policemen were following normal police procedure. Okay, if they were following normal police procedure, then why didn't he stand up for them all the way through?
Exactly, Jerry.
Why didn't he fight for them in front of this tribunal? Why didn't he go to the CBC and be more aggressive in their defense?
They're creating an atmosphere and a situation, both legally and psychologically, where you can't say anything to dispute them. You can't say anything. So we've given the most troubled, drunk, and I mean, we're talking 5-6 generations of fetal alcohol syndrome. They won't deal with it. They won't talk about it at all. It's their real problem. Nothing. Doesn't matter how much money we give them. Doesn't matter how much help. Doesn't matter how much grievance politics we play with them. They're never going to get better until they deal head on with their alcohol problem. It's staggeringly serious. And the globalists have been pumping in Oxycontin into the reserves to get all the elders stoned so that they don't even have their elder traditional people to help them, to guide them. They've decimated. And here's the thing, the natives won't even wake up to the fact that all of that is coincidentally happening to them. They are like gangs and drug enclaves on those reserves. And the only education they have is grievances against these so-called non-existent white supremacists. So anytime they see a white supremacist, they are triggered, like literally triggered. Okay, the violence, the attacks. I've had death threats This is the atmosphere that the globalists have set up. And you'd think the natives would just clue in that they're being used, but they don't. You know why? Because the chiefs are getting money and that's all they care. And these activists are all George Soros paid for, like the guys stalking us, like Louise and Sandy who stalked us. I mean, these people are, they're nutcases, and all they had to do was trigger nutcases and brainwash them and blame white supremacists, and next thing you know, they've got an army of people who will shut anyone down.
Well, and back to our story today, one of the ironies that struck me about it is the two Asian policemen and the Asian community could very well have claimed systemic discrimination based on their Asian heritage. Like maybe if these were white cops, it would have gone differently. Certainly if they had been Aboriginal cops, this would have gone differently.
Well, that's one of the things I say to them too, is just wait a second here. What if only all the different tribes only kept populating here? What if no white-skinned people, you call them, there's no such thing as white. What is white? It's like, this is white. Okay, it's not the same color. You can see that. We're all varying degrees of beige.
You pinky you.
Beige power. But at any rate, I mean, let's just say that Canada was only populated with all their tribes. I mean, like they'd still be fighting each other. Like, whose land would it be? Whose land would it be? Like, and whose fault would all this stuff be? Whose fault? Like, we're really and seriously, you can't turn back the hands of time. And if you are going to turn back the hands of time, give it all back. Like you have to. Colonialism hit everybody. Okay, missing children hit everybody. The queens and the kings and the ruling elites did this to everybody. These wars happened to everybody. It wasn't white people who did this. Like, just I'm born white, I think I'm just going to go out and oppress. So here's the thing about the anti-colonialists, the decolonized people. What it really is the same Hitler playbook. It's the permission to fry people in gas chambers. That's literally what decolonization means. Decolonization means fry white people. That's what it means. Like, what do you mean Like, you're not gonna like get rid of people, or like, here's the thing, it's supposed to be a unified thing, and for some reason the natives are acting like again, native supremacists, bullies and authoritarians to us, as if they own everything and they're going to tell us what to do, and it doesn't matter what anyone else says. Our laws don't apply. They don't matter. Our voices don't matter. The fact that our children live here and pay for them don't matter. Like, it's just bizarre how rude they are. They're so disrespectful. They dehumanize us. That's what decolonization means. It means they kill the white people. That's what it means. Ultimately, just so everybody knows, so that when they do decide that they're going to get violent, they have permission. Where are you, Jer?
I'm here.
I mean, we listen to them talk, right? We literally listen to them talk. Kill all the white people.
Well, there's other aspects to this we'll be covering in other videos in more detail and with specific stories.
I think we should wrap this up. Exactly, Jared. But that's sort of did I just see an orb? That's the gist of it. And that's why Jerry and I are end race-based law, because this is such a serious problem. And the natives need to get wise. In the back of my shirt says Unity for Canada. I don't know if you can see it, but that's the back of my shirt. Unity for Canada. And we need to come together. We really need to come together. The natives, they got to stop bullying us and being idiots about the globalists and being used to destroy Canada.
And of course, the way forward in that is that all Canadians in a real constitution should have equal rights. There should be no racial categories in a constitution. Rights designated according to which group you belong to is offensive to the whole concept of human rights. And that's our constitution.
And may I remind the natives, every time they talk, it's really bizarre, because it's as if they don't actually know who's in Canada. They think everybody is just this white skin and this white oppressor. Like, you need to come to Vancouver, man. It's a really difficult sell here in Canada, because everybody's from around the world and we all make it work except the natives.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say goodbye now. Thank you, Jerry. I just want to say, so the screen is on me for a second. Thank you very much for all of your wonderful posts, and racebasedlaw.com and racebasedlaw.ca. Jerry's back posting. He was sick for a long time and he's feeling a lot better, and I'm really glad. And so we're going to be doing a lot more of this. And again, Jerry's going to come in by phone so that we don't have to fuss around with the cameras and delay. We can just start doing more and more and more videos. So we are back. And we'll be all over social media soon too. We're getting back up and running on all the social media sites. So look for us and race-based law, because we need to come together here in Canada. We need to end race-based law. You cannot, I'll just wrap this up, then I'll give you a second to say goodbye, Jerry. You cannot, in good conscience, even remotely close to pretend that you're not racist and be behind these racist race laws. You're just a liar. You're just a racist thug liar.
One nation, one law.
Unity for Canada. Okay, Jerry, thank you again very much. I'll let you say goodbye now.
That was my goodbye. One nation, one law.
Okay, sweetie, bye.
Solution to all of this. Goodbye, Michele. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. We love you, honestly. We're coming back gangbusters, so look for us.